Hello, and welcome from Westminster Libraries. My name is Monica, and I work at Paddington Library. We're happy to have Kate Macdonald with us today for the second talk with Westminster Libraries to tell us all about recovering women's stories. Kate is a literary historian and the director of Handheld Press. And this afternoon, we're delighted to welcome our guest, Lucy Scholes of the Virago Books podcast, Our Shelves, and a regular contributor to the Paris Review, the Financial Times, the Times, and the Telegraph. The talk will be centered on retrieving women's voices from the library vaults. There will be another talk with Kate on the 15th of September on LGBTQ+ stories, and one more in mid-October about disability through fiction. Do check our website and sign up to the newsletters to find out more about these events. Before we get going, just to let you know that the talk will be approximately 40 minutes, followed by a Q&A. Do feel free to send us your questions at any point during the talk. The chat feature has been turned off, so please type all your questions and comments in the Q&A. The moderators, Susie and Sarah, are here with me this afternoon, and we look forward to seeing your questions. Well, that's it from me. I shall hand you over to Kate and Lucy.
Hi, Kate. It's lovely to see you again.
Yes, it's good. We're quite a long way apart. I think you must be in London and I'm in Bath in the west of England, but we have a lot in common because we first met in the Second Shelf, which is an antiquarian bookshop in London dedicated to women writers and selling pretty much only women writers. Can you tell us a bit about Second Shelf and how that connects to the idea of recovering women's writers?
Yeah, the Second Shelf is the brainchild of Alison Devers, who has made this incredible space in central London, which sells, like you say, antiquarian, rare books, secondhand books by women. And her collection is like nothing I've ever seen before, I think, for someone like myself and for you who really loves uncovering these old books and particularly seeing them in their kind of beautiful covers. Alison has a wonderful ability to track down beautiful editions of things, you know, things that are incredibly expensive to things that are very affordable. So anyone who is in London or has access to go there, I would really recommend going to visit. And her mission has been to, I think, obviously to kind of reinstigate women's writing into the sort of rightful place in the canon, but also I think more within the rare books industry to start to recognize that books by women are just as valid as books by men, because I think she always makes a point of saying that what got her into the trade is that she had gone to some rare books trades, I think, sort of book fairs, and she realized that a lot of the books that people were selling in the industry, a book that was written by a man would be priced at, say, £200, and a book by a woman from the same period, the same sort of level of kind of notoriety or fame, would be sort of £50 by comparison. And so there needs to be some kind of balancing going on there. So I think that's where she comes from. And obviously she's been a great supporter of everything that you're doing at Handheld Press as well. So sort of a match made in heaven, let's say.
Yeah, we had a couple of book launches there, which was just great. It was the ideal venue for an event talking about a forgotten woman writer and a forgotten woman's text. I wanted to start, if that isn't already the start, with a little game. Can you tell me as many names of publishing houses who are actively republishing women's fiction or stories? What can you come up with?
You're gonna catch me out now. Well, the obvious is Virago and their modern classics list, which everyone knows about, I'm sure. Penguin modern classics, they have plenty of women on their lists. Vintage modern classics, vintage classics, however you want to look at it. Daunt Books are doing a very interesting line in recovering certain women who've been out of print. Picador have started doing it recently of late as well, I've noticed. W&N, Weidenfeld and Nicholson, they have a new essentials classics list, which is mostly women, I think. They've got a couple of men on there, but it seems to me, off the top of my head, I think it's mostly women. Then, you know, you've got some other things like the New York Review of Books classics in America. What else am I thinking? There must be something obvious I've missed. Handheld Press, obviously.
Oh,
saying.
really? How extraordinary. Well, also Persephone Books.
Persephone is the big one.
Yeah.
That's another big one that I've forgotten. They have a nice line in bringing back interesting. They've just launched a whole new imprint called Faber Editions, which is going to be doing this for men and women. But yeah, like you say, Persephone, I think, in terms of women's writing, Persephone and Virago are the two big ones, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. Yeah. And before then we had Women's Press and Pandora, who have now disappeared, which is such a shame, because that Virago, Pandora and Women's Press together, that threesome, were so important in the late 70s, early 80s, for bringing, certainly women of my generation, giving them greater knowledge of other stories. We also have now Dean Street Press. Dean Street Press are doing a phenomenal amount of work bringing back women writers into print who might not be quite so admired by the canon. We have Valancourt Press in Canada, who have been for years doing amazing work with Gothic and horror of the late 19th century. Canongate Classics in Scotland, they were working from around the time that Virago began, but they were focusing on Scottish writers, so the sex wasn't an issue. Also in Scotland, B&W Publishing, again focusing on men and women, but important for the reprint, the idea of bringing authors back into print. Broadview, slightly more academic, but again, they bring back the women. And Gollancz. Gollantz's science fiction and fantasy classic series, two separate imprints, have been really important if you're interested in classic science fiction and classic fantasy. Oxford University Press, World's Classics. Did a Little Toller for country, rural. And then there's a minor publishing house who are sort of just up the road from me in Stroud, Girls Gone By, which specializes in almost facsimile reprints of classic girls' boarding school and pony books. I have a friend who absolutely adores their work. That's not a genre of fiction I was ever into as a girl, but for those who were.
Interesting. I don't know about that. I used to be a big reader of the Shalley School books by Eleanor M. Brent Dyer when I was a kid. I wonder if they're doing those. I must look into it.
Well, they might, yeah. Girls Gone By, I recommend them. And then we have Wordsworth Classics, which is so ubiquitous now. Everybody has a Wordsworth classic on their shelves, but they've attained invisibility. British Library Publishing, several lists of women writers, and Silver Press, who I don't know much about. But that is a big, big list, and that's mostly in Britain. There are so many companies who have already recognised the importance of publishing women's stories and bringing them back, but yet it seems to be hard to find some women writers, and that's a strange thing. Because you, in the Parish Review, in your column, you routinely you exhume the reputation of women writers who have been forgotten and say, why are these women forgotten? Why is it that some writers still have not been discovered?
Oh my goodness. I mean, this is the question. I mean, this is always a question, and this is a question that I always find myself asking every time I write a column, and I've been writing a column every month now for 2.5 years. And I think maybe I've written about 3 men in that time. So it's mostly women, which is partly because my own taste lies in that direction. But it's so much easier to find women having been neglected than men, let's put it that way. And you know what, so much of the time, often I've noticed that it's to do with women writing particular books that were ahead of the time when they were published, for example. So things that didn't resonate when the time that they were first published, but seemed to kind of gain momentum later on. So when I come to it today, I start realizing this is actually quite a modern novel that was ahead of the game when it's first around. The other thing I notice is that sometimes it's just a case of, I mean, this is almost, I don't know if this is depressing or should give us all hope, but some things just slip out of print. There are so many books published all the time, and keeping something in print is really, really hard. If it hasn't got the kind of, the regular push behind it that maybe sort of new books do all the time, where they're pushing out. Also, I think I noticed more recently that sometimes it's also that, so for example, somebody I wrote about recently was a novelist called Kay Dick, who was writing through the latter half of the 20th century. And she wrote, it would have been 5 or 6, I forget off the top of my head now, kind of interesting, really nicely written novels that were quite sort of set against sort of very refined European backdrops about sort of friends and families and sort of the entwinements, but they weren't particularly exciting, let's put it that way. And then in 1977, after a break of 10 years, she wrote this incredible sort of dystopian novel called They, A Sequence of Unease, which is being brought back into print next year, luckily.
But I think you had a lot to do with that.
I had a little bit to do with it, yes, because I wrote about it, and then it was picked up at the same time. A brilliant literary agent called Becky Brown picked it up, found a copy actually in a charity shop in Bath. So
yes, I know.
Great.
I've been to the shop with her. We've gone back there together to see if we can find any more treasure.
Oh, interesting. But I think what I noted particularly about Dick's work was that for somebody who'd written quite a lot of novels, they'd all been kind of, they'd all got interesting reviews. She was a well-known name, but then she sort of wrote this book out of the blue that people didn't really know what to do with. And so again, it's one of those books that I think resonates more with us today, but also for a lot of writers, that sort of plugging away book after book after book. If you then write one that's really, really interesting, it's sort of luck of the draw whether it's going to get picked up, whether it's going to even be noticed at the time, and then whether it's going to stand the test of time, right? Because that's the problem. I mean, you must find all the time that you're discovering things which you think, well, actually, I want to ask you this question. What is it that makes a handheld book? Like, what are you looking for? Something that is very of its time, something that is going to resonate with audiences today, something that is kind of forgotten for a particular reason? Like, what are you looking for?
I'm looking for edge. I'm looking for an extra reason to value and want to read this book. So the quality of the text has to be so good. It has to be outstanding. But at the same time, I am not interested in selling books about women sitting in drawing rooms being miserable because their life is not perfect. That isn't the kind of book I like. So let me show you. So here we are. This came out this year. This is a novel about a munitions factory. It could have been written by a man. It happens to have been written by a woman who was a brilliant wartime journalist. This is a memoir about the Second War by a novelist and a playwright, but it's about her life. So she's writing about something that's different to what is normally her sphere. And that is also interesting. So Rose Mccauley's Whatnot, which we published 2 years ago, that is a novel she should never have written because it's science fiction. And she was not known for her science fiction. Rose Mccauley's Personal Pleasures, this is just essays about the things that interested her and nobody else she thought would be interested. So she just put them in a book, and they're so good. They're coming out next month. This woman, Eleanor Mordaunt, she's a forgotten woman because she wrote terrifying supernatural short stories for about 40-50 years and has completely disappeared. But the stories, you would never know they were written by a woman or the gender is completely not important. It's the quality that's so good. That probably doesn't answer your question properly. I think if a book grabs me and I cannot stop reading it, that for me is the reason why I have to publish it, as long as nobody else has already. And I go through this very, very panicky period of, I found the book, it's amazing, I mustn't tell anybody else in case anybody else jumps in there ahead of me, especially if it's already out of copyright. That's a bit awkward. Although once I start publicizing it, then hopefully the book trade go, okay, Handheld's got it, we will back off and not just slide in there. Let me show you one that I did. I've got a great stack of them here.
I can hear you going.
Here they are. Yes. So Zelda Fitzgerald, Save Me the Wolves. That one, I had no idea Zelda Fitzgerald had written novels. I didn't know much about her other than I knew F. Scott Fitzgerald had a wife. And then an academic friend of mine in Glasgow told me through Twitter, oh, we need a new edition. I really want to teach this. And all we've got is a rubbishy edition from the 90s, which has got a really critical misogynistic introduction. So I said, right, of course, we'll do it. And then I realized she came out of copyright in 2019. So that was a very good reason to republish it. No copyright fees, no royalties. And I was quite prepared for many other big publishers to bring out a new edition, but nobody did. That was bizarre. January 2019, our little edition was out there and American colleges are snapping it up because they want to teach it. And none of the big US publishers are even interested. And that's what I find bizarre.
It's really funny though, isn't it? It's not always, sometimes the things I think that are going to be the sort of big hits, even the books I write about, sometimes the ones that I think people will be really interested in and will, because some of the stuff I've written about has now since then been picked up for republication, which is wonderful and is, the only thing you could really want out of this, because the point is to get more readers for these books. But I must admit, I am always surprised by certain things I write about, and I think someone's got to publish this, surely.
Yeah.
And nobody seems to notice it, and you think, what's going on there? So there's definitely, I feel like so much of this is almost gut instinct, right? Like what you were saying, it has to be a book which you really feel, you know, you have to feel passionate about, because otherwise you're not going to be interested in printing it. But I think also it's a good sign if you feel passionate about it, it's likely that other readers will feel similar, right?
Yeah, I have something to say. I can enthuse about it for weeks. So that is a very good sign. On the other hand, sometimes you will find a book which is superb in every respect, apart from the fact that it uses language which we cannot now use. Because so this past week I've been checking out the books by Elliot Bliss, who was a Jamaican writer from the 1920s and 30s, and she was very well spoken of. I had one person saying she's wonderful, I can never forget this book I've read. I've gone through 2 copies of it, and it was published by Virago in the early 80s, and I took it out from the London Library and I stopped short on page 2 because there are 3 instances of the N-word, because she's writing about Jamaican society in the 1930s from the perspective of a white colonial planter. I can't publish that. I could not sell that. So that book, no matter how admirable the quality of the writing and how necessary it is to rejuvenate that woman's character, her reputation, her skills as a writer, I can't sell that book, and I would not want to, because the language, we cannot now admit it, and that's tough.
I find that really interesting because I've had similar experiences. A book called For Frightened People by E. Arnott Robinson kind of springs to mind, which I remember reading quite a long time ago, and again was a Virago modern classic at one point. And I do admire Arnott Robinson's work, but going back to it again recently and rereading it, wondering whether I would write about it, it had very problematic descriptions of this sort of indigenous people. It's set in the Far East, and I just the other thing was about it though that it made me admire the writing less overall, because I found it quite hard to distinguish between, once I could see this kind of problematic, the racism in it, I found it very hard to actually enjoy it in the way that I thought I had enjoyed it when I'd read it before. I think those books you have to be quite careful in certain situations.
And other writers of the same period managed to get round the subjects without using the language we now find problematic. That's what sticks in my craw, that they chose not to examine the words they were using carefully enough. They just chose
that's the thing, isn't it? It's not, you can't use the excuse that just people were racist in those days, because that's not the case with all books. It clearly isn't.
Yeah, some people were really racist and some people were hardly at all, and 1 or 2 words could be snipped out, but not if it's, second page onward is just packed with them. So that is a real problem, and I have to be careful, because I'm not going to print a book I know will not sell because it's problematic. And what is the point? So
have you got to the point in your publishing where you know that there are certain things that sell, like certain things that your readers particularly like, let's say? Because you've published, how many books now have you published, ballpark figure?
We are on to our, I think 27.
Okay, so that's a lot. You must have a sense of, you must have regular readers who'll come back, who'll trust your judgment. And are there certain things that will go down well with them? And there are other things that you might want to sort of surprise them with, for example?
Yeah, well, I do try and surprise them. I tried surprising people with this, which is a classic science fiction novel from 1975. Sadly, it's not sold very well. Science fiction writers love it and readers love it, but it doesn't translate across, unlike this. This was for quite some time an absolute smash bestseller. It's fantasy, it's classic supernatural, and thanks partly to a review in The Guardian and partly to a review in the Washington Post, a year after it was published, it's gone through 4 or 5 reprintings already, because there's a massive appetite for short stories, and these are classic short stories from the 1890s to 1940. Supernatural, written by women, unknown, to be discovered. There are lots of different cross-cutting marketing edges there. And to my great delight, because I commissioned that, I knew the market needed a collection of supernatural classic weird fiction, because there was an awful lot by men, but there was almost nothing out there by women. So I commissioned Melissa Edmondson, who's a scholar in the field, and said, can you please put something together? And she said, here is my list. So she was primed and ready. I was just so delighted that it took off and did so well. And we have a second volume. Look, here is the second volume. which also did very well. And there's a male version called British Weird, which has got men and women both. But those two collections, women, supernatural, classic, that combination sells. I know that. And we're going to keep publishing classic weird by women because there is a market, to our huge delight.
Now, is there a market because it's not covered elsewhere, or is there a market because people just can't get enough of this stuff?
I think because it's not covered elsewhere. I mean, people like Mike Ashley, who is a really important scholar of the science fiction and fantasy, of publishing in science fiction and fantasy from the 1880s onwards. He has done a collection, several collections of anthologies with the British Library, for example, and with Gollancz. He's a really well-respected editor. But apart from him, I don't know of any other anthologist who is closely paying attention to what women wrote in those fields, which have normally been gendered male because the men were more predominant. And also the thing is, most of this fiction appeared in magazines, and magazine editors were generally male, especially in the first part of the 20th century. And there is certainly an argument to be made that once magazines began to be edited by women, and so the selection started to be done by women too, more women got into print in the pulps, in the science fiction fantasy genres. So there's a gatekeeping element we have to consider as well. So yes, it's partly you cannot get hold of this stuff, and partly this is amazing. Why have we never heard of these writers before?
I feel like those are the kind of books that people are, like you mentioned earlier that you're not particularly fond, for example, of those sort of, drawing room dramas, let's say, what we might think of when we think of sort of mid-century British women.
F.M. Mayer, I think she epitomizes it.
Okay. So those sort of things. So what you're looking for is stuff that's also outside the box in terms of classic, traditional stereotypes of gender, right? Like the kind of stuff you think women might be writing, particularly if it's historical, in the earlier 20th century.
Yeah, novels about women flying planes, or even men training to be nursemaids. Let's surprise readers. And also novels, fiction and non-fiction, that reflect social history that we don't know much about. For example, Women in Airplanes. I have been doing quite a lot of reading about the literature of flight and memoirs about flight from the 30s and the 40s. Okay. And there are several extremely well-known figures like Beryl Markham, Amy Johnson, and they're good. And Beryl Markham's biography, memoir, West with the Night, is just stunning, and I do wish I had the rights to that, but I don't. But other women did fly too, and then women in mountaineering. Dorothy Pilley was one of the first major British mountaineers, and I did look quite seriously at reprinting her classic mountaineering account of climbing in the Alps, but that's a bit too specialist. I don't think anyone except mountaineers would really want to read it. So there are degrees that it has to be an accessible text. And if it's technically specialist, if it's niche, your average reader must be able to understand it and enjoy it and want to read on. And that can be difficult because very often these texts were not written for your lay reader. They were written for other practitioners in the field.
Yes. I mean, that must be so tricky though, because there's a kind of move in general in publishing at the moment that people are very interested in forgotten women's stories, full stop. So whether these are, recently I reviewed a book that was telling the stories of sort of 5 forgotten female anthropologists, for example,
I read that. That was good.
Early 20th century. And I can imagine that some of those wrote anthropological tracts that obviously you wouldn't want to publish. But this kind of, I think there's such an appetite though for us finding these stories, particularly of women who were, breaking the mold a little bit in what they were doing at the time. Like you say, they were doing things that was necessarily in the realm what would have been considered sort of male privilege in that point. So there's lots of fascinating stuff out there, but you do have to be quite careful that you're not just publishing stuff just because it was written by a woman at a certain point in history,
exactly.
Right?
Yes, and just because it's written by a woman does not make it sellable.
Yeah.
Somebody, occasionally people send me their book submissions for me to consider. And there was an account, a biography written by a family member of a woman who was significantly important in the birth control movement, the Mary Stopes field, in the 30s and 40s. And yes, she was important, but the way the book was written, I thought, this is not enough. This is just the story of your extremely well-known ancestor, relative. And with regret, I had to say, no, I cannot see this selling. And subsequently, that author self-published the book, so it is out there. It can be got for those that are interested in that field, in that subject, in that person. But I could not see it taking off. I would have had to work so hard just to get a few sales.
Well, I think especially at the moment, because, you know, in terms of that list we made at the beginning of all the different imprints now available who are doing great stuff with this work, I've noticed, at least in the last few years, there's definitely much more of a competition for these books, right? I mean, there's many more people. It's not just the outliers. There was a day when it was the much smaller imprints like yourself, other people who really just doing that sort of uncovering work and had the specialization. And whereas bigger publishing houses, unless they had kind of very established lists like Penguin Classics or Virago Modern Classics, they weren't really touching these kind of backlist titles, these out of print stuff. But now it's become much bigger business that all these other places are looking for them. And so in one sense, that's brilliant, because it means that more and more stories are being recovered, but it also makes it harder, I think, for the smaller independents to kind of, you know, hold their own in that environment.
I spent weeks tracking down and reading and trying to trace the estate of Beryl Gilroy, who was a woman who was an amazing. She was a teacher in the 60s in London and the 70s, and she wrote a memoir, Black Teacher, about her experiences of being the only Black woman in the school, the only Black teacher in the entire city. And it's a terrific book. It's so worthy of republication. And I tracked down the family, and they said, oh, right, you need to talk to these agents. So I got to the agents, and the agent said, oh, we're so sorry, you're 2 weeks too late. So Faber have got it, and Faber are publishing it. There is no way I can compete with Faber. I think if we'd been face to face across the table, I would have gone, I'll just take my bag and go, because they have the money that I could only dream of. So yes, we cannot compete. My edge is I have 30 years of literary historical research behind me, and I know the field, and I know where to look. And that is what makes me, I'm the archaeologist digging in a place that I suspect from the survey I've done privately is probably where gold lies. That's my approach.
Well, I think that's the difference, isn't it? Because there's definitely there's a thing about having that kind of niche speciality and knowing where to find these books to begin with, that even some kind of bigger publishers don't quite have the expertise in, let's say, because they're used to dealing with kind of stuff that's more readily available. What I have noticed in this country, interestingly, in a couple of these kind of bigger lists, is that people have started to look a little bit further afield. Like there's been Virago have done very interesting things recently in terms of adding a lot of Black American writers to their Virago Modern Classics, from Gail Jones, who wrote Corregidora, through to Anne Petrie, who wrote The Street, which I think was the first ever book to sell 1 million copies by a Black woman in America, when it was first published in the 50s, I want to say. And they published the brilliant novels of Dorothy West. I don't know if you've read her, but she's wonderful. One novel and one collection of works. So they've sort of widened their remit that way. And, you know, Daunt Books published that wonderful Canadian novel Bear recently by Marianne Engel from the 70s, which again was not in print over here. So there are different ways of doing it. But you stick much closer to home, don't you? You're much more interested in British women writers.
Because I know British writers. I don't know the American field, and I don't know Dutch writers. I don't know French writers. I'm sadly limited by my Anglophones. I have tried publishing translations. Some they do sell, but they're not smashes, because I think the public are still a bit scared of translated work. So yes, I stick to what I know. I don't even publish Irish. I published one Irish writer, and it sank like a stone. So because I don't know how to market Irish fiction, I've got a gap there. I can do Scottish, I can do English. I can probably have a go at Welsh. In fact, I will be having a go at Welsh next year, but that's for a bloke, so we don't need to talk about that. So I stick to what I know. And if people come to me with a book, I still have to be enthused. It's all very well them being enthused and them being the expert, but if I'm doing the marketing, which is what is the case because we can't afford to bring on a marketing manager, then I have to really love it, and I have to know instantly what the marketing angles are and how I can reach them. That's the sticky thing. So yes, it's sort of a bit me, which isn't what I wanted.
but it's what you've got, so you've got to
what
run
I've
with
got.
it.
Yeah.
But
So
I think that's also the magic, because I feel like with a lot of these lists, things like Persephone has a very particular taste that's very driven by Nicola Bowman, who is the publisher and who runs the company. And again, she's worked up she's got an incredible list that is very much about the books that she wants to publish, but that's absolutely fine, because that's what, that's also what her audience have got used to and what they want out of it. And so people will, recognize your taste, and they'll want to read Handheld Press books for that kind of reason. And I think there's something quite nice about having different identities, because, the bigger lists like Penguin Classics, obviously there's, though they publish a lot of really brilliant books. I'm certainly not saying you shouldn't go out and read these wonderful titles, but, they have a different identity to the smaller independent lists, I think. And that's a nice way of being able to hold your own against these kind of big monolithic publishing houses, let's say.
Yeah, I think OUP and Penguin also have the edge. I mean, OUP began well over 100 years ago publishing classics along with Everyman at the beginning of the 20th century, because the reprint market is that old. But also they cater for the academic market. They publish text for students, so they go right from the 12th century onwards. Whereas I'm very early 20th century. I'm a sort of 1890 if I absolutely have to, up to about 1950. That is my range. Outside that, it's only because I know I love the book. But within that sort of 60-year period, that's the literary history I know about. And there's still a lot to find. I'm astonished at how much there is. I keep tripping up over, or one thing leads to another. That's a lovely thing.
Yes. Well, I was going to ask you, because obviously, we're doing a talk for Westminster Library here, but I mean, because libraries play a huge role in me finding the books I want to write about. I mean, I presume they do the same for you, right? They're an invaluable resource.
Oh yeah. During lockdown, the London Library, I joined it because of lockdown, because it was the only library I could get the books I needed to read. My local library in Bath and the Libraries West network is enormous, but again, lockdown, the staff weren't allowed to work. So London Library was fabulous, but Bath, Libraries West is where I go first, because I can actually go and get the books myself. I'm renewing my British Library reader card next week. Yay! But you can't take the books out from there. And then there's interlibrary loan. So I found recently a book I've been trying to hunt down. I found it in Swansea University Library, and I did it through interlibrary loan and paid for it through Libraries West. So that you just have to know how to negotiate and how to track down the book you want. But yes, an awful lot of the books we have published, I have found originally through the libraries, and I borrowed them and gone, I can't give this back, it's so wonderful. I have to find a compromise.
Yeah, exactly. It's I wouldn't be able to do what I do without libraries. I mean, I buy a lot of secondhand books, but I could never afford to buy all the ones I would need to do the kind of research for if I didn't have access to a multitude of libraries.
And very often, an awful lot of the books I read, but I say that with inverted commas, I'm not reading them. I'm looking at the first 4 or 5 pages, possibly the first chapter. And if it hasn't taken by then, there's no point reading further. So I take an awful lot of books out of the library that go back the next day, because no, except 1 in 20 perhaps actually takes, and then I have to work a bit further.
Yeah. Are there particular authors that who would be your dream? This is a really terrible question to ask, but if you could republish anyone, who would be your absolute dream? Or any title?
Well, Beryl Markham.
Okay.
Yeah, West with the Night. That is the current book I really, really wish I could publish, but I can't. The thing is, if I start telling you my dreams, I'm telling the world my secrets, and they will steal them, and I will not be able to publish my dreams because someone else will go, I'll just take that first. So I'm not telling you. I'm sorry.
Okay, that's true. If there was somebody listening to this talk and they didn't read a lot of reprints, as in they were buying, more contemporary books, which is exactly what I used to do, and they wanted to kind of know how to get into reading your list, like, is there a particular place you would recommend people start, or would it
I would say start with what you like. What is the kind of book you like reading? Identify the elements of it, and then let me know, and I will find you a reprinted a classic from the past that will work in the same way, or that might tick that box. I would not suggest a particular title to an anonymous reader, because I've got no idea what their tastes are. So it depends what you like. It depends what you're looking for. It depends on I mean, are you going on a long train journey and you want to be utterly absorbed, or do you expect to have to be interrupted every 20 minutes by children? You know, there are different modes and different conditions of reading as well. So I can't even give you a useful portmanteau answer to that either. I'm really sorry.
That's all right. That's all right. And has there been, maybe this is an easier question, has there been, maybe it's not because it's like making you choose between your children, but is there a particular book that you've published on your list that you are especially proud of, or had a particularly interesting story behind you finding it?
Yes, this one. I am so proud of this one. Is this one that you helped me with the launch for? I can't remember.
I think we did do the launch for that at Second Shelf.
This one. So Rose Macaulay, whatnot. So Rose Macaulay, in 1918, Rose Macaulay was working for the Ministry of Information in the war, and she was just beginning an affair with a married man called Gerald O'Donovan, who was a former Catholic priest. He was married, had 3 children. And she wrote this novel. It was her 8th novel, and it's a science fiction speculative novel about the Ministry of Brains after the First World War, decreeing who can marry who can breed with whom to stop people being born stupid, so we'll never have war again. It's a very crude thought. It's eugenics. It's also about women working. When should women work and why? And it's about people and hypocrisy, because there's a twist. Anyway, so this novel exists. I didn't know it existed until I did a lot of research on Rose Macaulay when I was an academic. And I put together this massive book of essays by other people, but I did all the bibliographical research. And I thought, good Lord, that title, whatnot, I've never read that. All the other novels I've read, because it's really hard to find. I found it in the British Library, and it was the 2nd edition. And then I did a bit of research, and I realized this book, when it first came out, had been pulled by the publishers almost immediately because 3 pages were libelous. So they pulled it. They made her write blah to cover up the libel, and then republished it a year later, and it sank like a stone because there was, I don't know, no money left for marketing. I'm not sure. And she was also bringing out her next novel by then in 1920. So this book sort of disappeared from sight, and she never wrote anything like it again. Satirical, yes, but not science fiction, not speculation. And I read it and thought, this is amazing. We've got to write more about this. We've got to, discuss this as academics, because that was when I was an academic. And then it was on my wish list for when I wanted to be a publisher. And when I decided to set up Handheld, I was talking to my friend John Clute, who is an eminence gris of science fiction history, of writers, and the whole genre of science fiction. He knows everything, and he's a book collector. And I said, I really want to see the 1st edition so I can see what these 3 pages were that got pulled. And he said, I'll just fetch it from the shelf for you.
He's the kind of person you want to know if you're in our line of work.
Very much that kind of person. Yeah. He had not only had the 1st edition, which not even the British Library has, he had the edition that the publisher, Michael Sadler, had initialed in pencil the bits to be taken out.
Wow.
So okay. I photographed them, and that's what we published. And that was all well and good. So it was to come out in March 2019. In December 2018, I was sending out my initial publicity to the book trade, to the bookseller, and Alison Flood, the Guardian journalist who also writes for the bookseller, said, Kate, could I have the PDF? And I said, okay, yes, of course. And I was really inexperienced. I did not realize that you have to cultivate Guardian journalists closely. So I said, yeah, fine, have the PDF. And I forgot about it. And about 3 weeks later, I came out of the gym. This is when I used to go to the gym. I haven't since lockdown. And my phone was exploding because I was getting so many orders on our website for this book because she'd written a story in The Guardian about it. So I sold 81 copies that day. Wow. We had to reprint it twice before March. And until very recently, it was our absolute bestseller. I love that book because it's so forgotten. And the most important reason, the reason why The Guardian wrote about it is that Aldous Huxley, who'd been a close friend of Rose Macaulay at the time she was writing this, 14 years later, he pinched several of her ideas from the book to write Brave New World.
Yeah.
Hey, forgotten woman author, forgotten story, bring it back. So that's why I love my job.
That's perfect. And that's interesting because it really shows that reviews do really help you sell, right?
The effect of a review in national press, especially if it's on the online, on the website, is phenomenal for sales. And I'm so grateful for any writer, any reviewer who gets our stuff in an online article, because it just lives forever and it keeps selling our books to people who may never have heard of us otherwise. It's superb.
Amazing. It's interesting because as a reviewer, I'm always a bit unsure whether people really take any notice of what you say. So
I think a lot of people do. Anyway, I think now we've reached our limit. I think we need to wind up. Monica, would you like to call us in?
Thank you. No, it was lovely and super interesting. We were actually listening to you and commenting with my colleague Sarah here next to me, and we've come up with a few questions. If we have time, we would like to ask them.
Okay, good.
But first, with let me read the first question, which is by Joanne. Has the advent of ebooks changed the demand of certain types of stories and resurrected any that may have been ignored in their own time?
I would say no. I would say ebooks are just another kind of format, and it makes books much more accessible to people with sight impairments, because they can change the size of the typeface. It's just another format. I would not say that it has changed demand for a particular type of fiction or genre. What do you think, Lucy?
Yeah, I think the same. I mean, the issue is that obviously if there are certain old books that you can't read in ebook form until they're reprinted. So from our point of view, it's kind of harder to cut, there's plenty of things I read on my iPad in PDFs or whatever, but old books, you have to go and get them out and actually touch them. But then everyone wants to bring them out as ebooks when they're publishing these days, because you want to have the both copies, right?
You do. It's essential. Yeah.
And another question, thank you. And another question would be, such a fascinating conversation. Is marketing women's books very different to marketing men's books?
What's a women's book and what's a men's book? That's the problem. It's who you're marketing to. So if I were marketing a novel by a woman that was about engineering in a battleship during a war, I might anticipate that men would be more interested. So it depends what the book's about. Yeah, I think there's more to it. There's way more. I don't think you can simplify it into a book by a woman, a book by a man. It's a subject, it's who they thought they were writing for. Yeah, it's complex. And each book is marketed on its own merits, to its own specific target, I guess.
Do you steer clear of using the term women's writing when you're marketing stuff or when you're talking about things? Because I think that's very interesting. I find from the other side of things, looking at which publishers, I mean, if you've got just a female only list, that kind of makes sense. But some people really don't like the term women's writing, and other people really lean into it because there are, I mean, I think, again, maybe it's taste of readers, right, that sort of dictates it to a certain extent.
Well, there are two different markets then. In that case, you've got the people who buy the books for the bookshops, and then you've got the customers who buy the books. And so I know when I'm doing the initial marketing, I have to prepare what we call an advance information sheet, which goes to all the book buyers for Waterstones, for Smiths, for I've forgotten all the bookshop names. Anyway, they like to know that a book will fit into thriller, crime, women's writing. Should there be a bookshop big enough to have a women's writing shelf, or a market, or perhaps a newsletter that's targeting women? So that's how it works. But for the human being, the customer who pays the money to buy the book and take home, yeah, I think if the book was clearly about women's lives by a woman and it's all about the woman's experience, I might use the phrase women's writing. But I find that quite general, actually. I think you can be a lot more specific than women's writing.
Yeah.
Next question from Rick. Do you ever publish lost children's books?
Sorry, say that again.
Do you ever publish lost children's books?
We are about to, in January, bring back a novel by Malcolm Saville. And that is a sort of, it would be classified as YA now, but at the time it was a children's book, and it's absolutely superb. I was talking to somebody today about a tiny children's book, which her children love, and I thought, do I want to go into children's book and I thought, no. Children's books are a very discrete market, and as ETE, not EET, and I don't have the experience. I've never been a bookseller selling children's books. I've been a bookseller for other kinds of fiction, genres, but not, so I don't know the field well enough. The Malcolm Saville, I'm getting enthusiastic about because I love that book. But I'm not getting enthusiastic because it's a children's book, and I'm not really pitching it to a children's market. So me, myself, no, that's not a skill. Children's fiction, children's writing is not a sector I have experience or skill in. So no, sorry.
Yeah, I feel there's more of a divide between like adult books and children's books than there is between women's or men's writing or anything like that. It's the biggest, it really is a very discrete. Yeah, I mean, even in kind of a larger publishing house, it's so separate because you're dealing with such a different audience, I think.
Yeah, and there's the production quality too. You've got far more illustration. You've got completely different design questions to tackle. It's just not something I'm set up to do. So not me, no. Others maybe, but not me.
Next question. How do you discover these forgotten books? Through connections from the other authors, from recommendations, or just finding them by chance?
What do you think, Lucy?
Yeah, all of the above. I mean, when I started writing the column, for example, I definitely had a few books up my sleeve that I wanted to write about, that were on my radar over the years from various, whether it was from kind of my work in academia or other things that I'd read. And then once I started looking into it more and more, there's all manner of ways you can come up with things. I mean, even when I go to the library or use online resources to look at old reviews of books from the time, I'm always very interested in what else is being reviewed on that page. Or, those sort of, seeing adverts of books in old newspapers, going down some internet rabbit hole where you'll start looking at the works of one person, and then then a comparison is made to another author, and then you kind of look at their work and you keep going. It certainly takes a degree of hunting. Some things you do just stumble across. I've definitely come across books which I've been either in libraries or in secondhand shops. I've been attracted to the cover or the blurb or something and gone from there. But that is definitely rarer. You do have to do a fair bit of digging. But I find it quite fun, and I never used to like doing research when I was an academic, so I don't know what's changed now. I think it's the way that I can pick and choose about what I do. I don't feel like I have to cover all my bases anymore. I just can go down this rabbit hole and find something out here, or go down something else and find but then it's equally frustrating if you found a book you really like and you can't find anything out about the author, particularly from my point of view when I'm writing about it. I wrote I think my most recent column was about a Black American writer called Cleo Overstreet, who wrote a book called The Ball Hog Woman, which was published in 1970s. And all the research I could do, I could only find one obituary of her life and one, I think maybe 2 reviews that had ran at the time. So it's not a lot to work with, which was enough to write about it, but I would love to find out more. So, it's always a bit of a bind.
Yeah, it can be extremely hard. I found our current bestseller, which is here. That one, Business as Usual, storming bestseller. I found that by accident. I went to give a talk at the Angela Thirkell Society. There was a little book sale afterwards, and somebody had brought their old 1960s library edition. I bought it, I looked at it, I thought, beautiful, beautiful illustrations. That bit's funny, I'll take that, £3. And I read it on the way home in the train. I nearly missed my stop. We published it. Took a lot of effort to get the estate. And now, because I did the research to write the introduction, I know an awful lot more about the authors, because I met the heir who lives in Orkney. And it happened to be that we were going to Orkney for a holiday anyway. So I went to Orkney and talked to him and borrowed things and took photographs. And then very recently, I realized, hang on, her husband, he was a writer. So I looked up his books. And that was an experience of opening the book and then sitting there gripping it, reading until I was finished, because it was so amazing. So we're publishing 2 of those next year in 1 volume. So that connection, that serendipity, and then following the golden thread of just storytelling excellence Yeah.
And you also get a lot of people recommending stuff to you once it becomes people become aware that this is something you're doing. People, I don't know if you find this, Kate, but people come to me and they say, oh, have you heard of this book or that book? And sometimes they're great, sometimes they're not, but it's again, it's all useful fodder, let's say.
Yes, yeah. I mean, sometimes people do recommend things, and I think privately, over my dead body, I'm so sorry. I don't think that's correct.
I've recommended things to Kate before, and she said that to me publicly. So, it is all about taste sometimes.
It certainly is. Yeah.
Sharon is asking a few questions. Where can we get your lists? And then, are your books therefore very old? And have they been out of print?
Oh, okay. So you can find my books on handheldpress.co.uk and in any bookshop in the world. We are distributed worldwide. So just ask a bookshop and they can find us. We publish the books. The original publications date from about 1907 to 1975 is the most recent. But the 75 one, that's a bit of an anomaly. I think 1946, 48 is the cutoff before then. So that's the range. And I've forgotten the last bit. What was the last question?
Were they all out of print, I think?
Oh, no. Yes, actually, they were all out of print, but not about half of them were out of copyright. The others are still in copyright. So I've been making deals with agents and estates and things. So I hope that answers that question.
What was the title of your bestseller, Next by Romy?
Business as Usual.
Business as Usual by Jane Oliver and Anne Stafford. It's adored. The Sunday Express loved it. WI Life, Women's Institute magazine, loved it. Times Literary Supplement loved it. It's the kind of book you read and then you give to your mother, your sister-in-law and your auntie, and then your daughter steals it and gives it to her friends. It's just a word of mouth smash. It's fabulous. And it's about a bookshop in Selfridges. I mean, what more could you want? And it's funny and it's got really good drawing.
Did you know from the beginning, that's my question, that it was going to be successful? Did you have a feeling about it?
I think I was determined I was going to make it successful, but my initial marketing ideas fell completely flat. I was convinced Selfridges were going to take it and run with it and make it a fabulous thing, and they had absolutely no interest because they don't really sell books. I've kind of missed that important fact out of my great planning. I did not think it would sell by word of mouth. I really thought it would be critically acclaimed. But then at the same time, I knew my mother would like it and my aunt. And it's that kind of market. It's for older women and it's also for very young women. The young women market took me by surprise. There's a bookseller in the London Review Bookshop, Gail. She wrote about it in the London Review Bookshop blog saying, I love this book so much, or words to that effect, because it's about a young single woman in London learning to manage her budget and move from one grotty flat to one slightly less grotty flat and try to handle a love affair that's actually not going too well. And oh, there's an interesting man over there. All this stuff, which is the stuff of single women in London's lives since time began. I mean, my life was a bit like that in my 20s in London. And I had missed that factor. And I think a lot of the sales of this book are because it appeals to people today. It resonates, as you said, Lucy. It resonates with a really wide readership, not the one I first thought of.
It's always interesting when that happens, though, particularly with a forgotten book that you're bringing back, that one thinks that I've had this where I've thought that there's one element of it that's going to be the thing that people latch onto, and then actually it's something else entirely that is either equally or more successful. It sort of takes me by surprise. It makes you realize that, yeah, sometimes the way you read something, you forget these kind of very obvious bits of it.
Exactly. And I wish I had more people to talk to about the books I want to publish. At the moment, all I've got is my husband, and he is usefully not really, he hasn't got a literature background. He's a mathematician and he does planes and bikes. So if I can persuade him that a book I love is going to be a winner, that's good. It's pretty likely it's going to work. But I need more. I need an informal feedback loop of something, people I can talk to. I miss having an office. I don't have an office, I have a spare bedroom. But if I worked in a proper publisher with a proper publishing office, I could have these editorial discussions that I think I could do. Yeah, I could do with that. But here we are. We make the best of what we got.
Yeah.
Simon is asking, is thanking first of all for the fascinating and extremely thought-provoking event. And he's asking, there are many examples of women publishing under male names to avoid any sexist bias, the Brontes, etc. Can the panel think of any men who may have done the reverse, maybe to aim at particular readers?
That's a really good question. There are people who've done it.
There are, yeah, and I'm trying to think.
Yeah, off the top of my head, I'm really not sure. But I find that it's so interesting though, because when women do it, they do it to be taken more seriously, and when men do it to tap into a particular audience that they think that it's not about being taken seriously. It's not about the quality of the work. Suddenly, it's about the reader, right?
I think there's at least one, possibly two, male writers who are extremely successful in the romance genre. Like they are genuinely financially successful, critically acclaimed. But I read about them in the last year or two, and I thought, oh, that's interesting, because it just hadn't occurred to me. But that's their field, and they're extremely good at it. So, but I don't know what their names are.
I think that's slightly in that it does tend to be maybe more genre-led. So, and often it is more stereotypically sort of what has been traditionally female genres, or what we think of as female genres. And I don't think I mean, I'm certainly not an expert in that sort of stuff, so I don't know. You know what will happen the minute we stop this conversation? We'll both think of somebody. So I apologise to them. It definitely does happen. It definitely does happen. So I think maybe not so much these. I don't know. Maybe it does happen these days. We're just not so aware of it. But it certainly would have happened in the past.
Yeah, I think there's a husband and wife duo who write very successful crime novels together, and I think it's under a female name. But that's the two writing together. Anyway,
okay,
we could go down a long rabbit hole.
Yeah, sorry.
Rick is asking, who is the author of the dystopian novel that Lucy mentioned? I think she said it was called The They.
Oh, They. It's written by a woman called Kay Dick, and it's going to be out here in the UK published by Faber next spring, so in February next spring. And I would highly recommend it.
And one last question, which is from Sarah here. Have you recovered any novel written by a woman of color recently?
I'm looking, and I'm not looking in the right places. I want to find them, and I don't know why I can't. I do know that there's a bookshop in Atlanta, Georgia, that specializes in, is a secondhand book, antiquarian bookshop that specializes in writers of color. I should talk to that woman, but I feel that she's doing America. I don't know where the Black writers, the BAME writers, the writers who are not white, I don't know where they are, who were publishing before 1950. I would love to find out. I would love to read them.
There's a lot of, I come across a lot of interesting stuff, definitely more American. The Paris Review is a American publication, so a lot of I do write about British writers as well, but I do also write a lot about American writers. And in the last couple of years, I've written about a novel called Mojo Hand by a Black female writer called J.J. Phillips. This was written in 1966, I think it was first published. It's a Black female beat novel. It's absolutely brilliant and completely forgotten, but fingers crossed it should be coming back into print at some point soon.
Okay, good.
I definitely recommend that. There's another, Carleen Hatcher-Plight was a brilliant Black American writer from the sort of same period, early 70s. And she spent quite a lot of time living in Paris. So she has a distinctly sort of European feel as well as the sort of American side of her writing. And I wrote about her second book, which was called Sister X and the Victims of Foul Play. It's a brilliant title. That's set in Paris in like mid-70s, let's say. And I've written about like Black South African writers. Nora Gabavu, she's quite an interesting one. She was the first, she she's a Black South African writer from the 1950s, but she was educated here in the UK and married a very sort of upper class white British man, and so spent quite a lot of time living here. And she was the editor of which magazine? I can't remember now. The Strand magazine for a while. She was the first female editor, but the first Black female editor of a British magazine. Yeah, she did that for a short period of time. And she wrote a couple of autobiographical works. They're not novels, they are memoirs, but one of them is about returning to South Africa after her mother, I think her mother or her father's death, I apologize for forgetting which, and then making a journey through South Africa to go and visit her sister who lived elsewhere. And then she wrote a kind of follow-up which was about her sort of upbringing there. That was quite interesting. But I don't think that, I mean, she's much more well known in South Africa, but not so much over here, for example.
I think there could well be Francophone Black writers in Paris. But I don't speak French well enough to be able to read them properly. It also occurs to me that people determined to make a career in literature in Britain would probably hide the fact that they were Black as best they could to have a better chance of getting published. And that deception, that necessary deception, may have died with them. So it is possible that some writers who are minor, but are known about, may well have been Black, but we just can't know.
Penguin recently just launched a new list of reprinting Black British writers, and Bernadine Evaristo, who won the Booker Prize a couple of years ago, she has been the sort of series editor, I think, on that, helping them. And there's some really brilliant titles in that. Things like Minty Alley, that would be worth looking at if you're interested in that sort of era. You missed out on the Beryl Gilroy, unfortunately. That would have been
but I'm sure Faber will publish everything Beryl Gilroy wrote. There's several novels in that estate.
Yeah, there is. I mean, I think once you hit sort of 1950s onwards and the Windrush generation, there's some brilliant Black writers. A lot of them actually are in print. Like, you know, people like Sam Selvon, they've been Penguin Modern Classics for quite a long time now. So I mean, there's certainly uncovering work to be done. Absolutely, I'm not saying there isn't, but you know, there is stuff out there that you can find as well.
But you know, if people have a suggestion for writers I need to investigate, please tell me. You can find me at handheldpress.co.uk. There's a contact form, I think, but the email address is on an awful lot of those pages.
Send Kate brilliant ideas.
Do the world needs your brilliant ideas.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kate. Thank you for joining us again. And thank you, Lucy, for being with us this afternoon. It's been absolutely lovely. Thank you for all the people who have participated and for the lovely comments that you've left in the Q&A. We thoroughly appreciate it. We're pleased that you've enjoyed our talk. And just to remind you that we will be sending an email with a feedback form quite shortly. And we would be very grateful if you could give us your feedback, so that it's always nice to pass it on to our speakers, and apart from the ones that you've left in the chat today, in the Q&A today, sorry. And another thing is that we will be also sending an email in the next few days, I think, with a link to the recording of this event. So for all of you to have. And as I said, the next event with Handheld Press and Kate will be on the 15th of October, and it will be about LGBTQ plus stories. So we look forward to seeing you on for that event. And that's all for us tonight. Thank you again, Kate. Thank you, Lucy. And thank you, Susie and Sarah in the background to help me tonight. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much.
See you soon.